Well, good evening, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and it's a joy to welcome you again to the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation's Spring Lecture Series. We really appreciate you joining us this evening as we continue to explore the 20th century movers and shakers in Community of Christ history. Tonight, we will hear from our very own Sherry Mesle-Morain as she explores the life and legacy of Carl Mesle in a lecture called Carl Mesle, Pastor in a Time of Turmoil. Well, in addition to our spring lecture series, we have a summer book series that's going to begin here soon. It's another book series. Things went so well with the Joseph Smith III biography series this winter that we're going to do it again this summer. The online summer book series will explore and discuss a collection of great books, many of which are featured here on the screen. We will begin the summer series with Benjamin Park and his new book, Kingdom of NAUVOO. We will also host an evening discussion with the author on Thursday, June 17th. Benjamin will share a presentation and we will open the floor for discussion along with Q&A with the author. It's sure to be a great night. We meet with our second author, Spencer McBride, the following week to discuss his new book, Joseph Smith for President. This book is literally hot off the press, and I couldn't be more thrilled that Spencer McBride will gather with us online for an evening discussion on June 24th. Be sure to get your hands on his new book, and it's available already at the Red Brick store. Lastly, we will spend the month of July exploring David Howlett's book on the Kirtland Temple. A number of former site directors and special guests will gather with us during this time to give additional perspective on the story behind Kirtland's historic House of the Lord. David Howlett, the author, who you see here, will meet with us the last night of the series to share more about his research and to answer any questions we might have about his book. Of course, all of these books are available now for purchase at the Red Brick store, including the brand new Spencer McBride book. The address for the Red Brick store is also on the screen and in the chats. Needless to say, it's sure to be a great summer of church history. And to learn more about the summer book series, I encourage you to go to our webpage. You can see the address here on the screen, as well as in the chat box. Be sure to register to save your online seat, as seating is limited for the summer series. Both Peter Smith and tonight's guest speaker, Sherry Mesle-Morain, serve on the board of directors for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. This is a very generous group that cares passionately about Community of Christ Historic Sites. Our board members' dedication to preserving church heritage includes more than words. And tonight, it's my pleasure to announce that the Foundation's board of directors has made a $20,000 matching pledge for the spring fundraising campaign. This exciting news means that the board will match the first $20,000 in donations received tonight and throughout our spring campaign. So if you gave $50 tonight, they would make it a $100 donation. You gave a $100 donation, they would make it a $200 donation. So you can double your donation and double your impact at the historic sites, thanks to the generosity of our board of directors. This is huge, and I couldn't be more grateful to the board. For those wanting to make an online donation, you will find the donations link in the chat box. You're also welcome to send a donation in the mail to the address found in the chat box. Thank you for your generous support as we strive to preserve church heritage. And finally, I have the absolute privilege of introducing you to our wonderful guest speaker this evening, Sherry Mesle-Morain. Before and after raising 2 children, Sherry spent most of her work life in higher education, more recently as Director of Financial Aid Services at Graceland University in Lamoni, Iowa, her city of residence. In retirement, Sherry is busier than she ever was when she worked. She served on the Lamoni City Council, and she presently conducts intake interviews for the Lamoni Food Pantry's Emergency Relief Fund. Before she served as president of the John Whitmer Historical Association, Sherry held the role of executive director of John Whitmer for 3 years. Before the pandemic, every Thursday morning found her quilting with the Lamoni Mite Society, the longest continuously running quilting society in the state of Iowa. The impetus for selecting this topic for her John Whitmer presidential address was the fact that her father, Carl Mesle, kept every piece of paper he either penned or received. And she reports that her husband, Bill, was patient with Pastor Mesle's personal archive as it was spread over every service of her living room. So thank you, Sherry, for agreeing to share with us tonight. I'll now hand the microphone on over to you, as we are all really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on Carl Mesle, a pastor in a time of turmoil.
Thank you, Barbara, for such a nice introduction. I'm tickled and honored to be asked to do this. Dad would probably like it too. Carl Mesle, pastor in a time of turmoil. Carl Mesle's variation of Edwin Markham's lines from his poem Outwitted comes to mind when I think of Dad. It's familiar to all of you. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout, they drew a circle that shut him out. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and took him in. Julie Meisinger, a source of delightful Carl Mesle stories, reports that as a young adult, she worked at the RLDS auditorium with guide services and as switchboard operator. She said Dad always stopped to share a word with her, whereas other officials would walk right by without so much as a nod. He cared about everyone, she said. One of her stories illustrates just that. On one occasion, when a busload of children was expected for a tour of the auditorium, an eccentric old guy who was a well-known wanderer and harmless broke in what was described as a bizarre kick dance routine right there in the foyer. Julie wondered how she could ask him to leave before the children arrived, fearing he would frighten them. As so often happened, Carl Mesle appeared on the scene and quickly took in the dilemma. Brother, are you hungry? Well, yes, the man replied. They are serving a free lunch at Stone Church right now. Why don't you go have some lunch? Before the man could reply, Mesle continued, I'm going over there myself, so I can walk you over. Thus was averted, with soft words and gentle action, an embarrassing situation with no humiliation to this vulnerable man. Frank Carl Mesle Jr. was born in 1914 in Oneida, New York. He grew up next door in the little town of Sherrill, where his father worked all his life with the Oneida Silver Company. Dad's lifelong membership in the Boy Scouts of America reminded him constantly of the Boy Scout oath. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country and to obey the Scout law. You know it, a Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. He took this oath seriously. After graduating from Graceland College and then the University of Iowa in 1937 with a BA in history, he followed his passion and joined the Boy Scouts of America as a field executive. Following an intensive month of training at the Schiff Scout Reservation, the Boy Scout training facility in Mendham, New Jersey, his first assignment was in Camden, New Jersey, the roughest of inner cities. As he put it, I spent 3 growing and great years helping spread scouting, particularly in the heart of Camden, where boys at age 14 and 15 had never been outside of the city limits until their troop went camping. The Scouts learned about the great outdoors as Dad learned about life in the inner city. Dad left the East Coast to continue as field executive in Kansas City, but his work was interrupted by World War II when he was recruited by the United States Army in 1940. After attending officer candidate school, he was assigned to the Office Chief of Engineers in Washington, D.C., with the title of Chief of Technical Information, a position that brought him into personal contact with Army personnel from privates to the Secretary of War. Along with his wife and 2-year-old daughter, he returned to Kansas City in scouting after the war. It was then in 1946 that he received his first invitation to go under appointment for the church, this one from F.M. Smith, which he delayed. With the second invitation in 1947 from Israel A. Smith, he and Mom agreed that the assignment as Center Stake Youth Director was a perfect fit for him. And so they moved with their now 2 daughters to Independence, Missouri, where they would live the rest of their lives. Dad served as Center Stake Youth Director from 1947 to 1951, during which time their son was born. Then his assignment was changed to Assistant to the First Presidency with specific responsibility as World Church Youth Director. This assignment included all the church's youth programs, Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts for boys, Skylarks and Orioles for girls, Zion's League for teenagers, and Zioneers for older teenagers. Camping, his first love, was a huge part of this responsibility. In 1957, he was assigned to ministry to college and university students and to military personnel. In 1967, another major shift was made when he began his work as coordinator of family life. In response to his first invitation to go under appointment, Dad indicated he had no interest in being a missionary or a pastor. Youth work was his passion. The arc of his career, however, seems to have prepared him for the role of pastor, specifically the role of pastor of the Stone Church, the Mother Church in Independence, Missouri, during what developed as troubled times. Following the Joint Council seminars in 1967 with St. Paul's Seminary professors, the church leadership made the decision to purposefully lead the institution away from being the one true Church of Christ on earth and toward becoming a church of mission. Like so many other Christian denominations in the national turbulence of the 1960s, the RLDS leadership wished to know how it could speak to a generation very greatly alienated from the traditional moral and cultural values. If we cling too tenaciously to a static institutionalized church structure, we run a great risk of no longer having a church after one more generation. The church leadership was reassessing the role of the church, which held its image for longtime faithful members as the one true church and as not Mormon. In essence, the church leadership found themselves trying to serve 2 populations, the loyalists and the progressives. The ensuing tension and chaos was threatening to tear the reorganization apart. The Ethics of Dissent, a report by the First Presidency on the Standing High Council's study of the ethics of dissent in the church, was delivered to the World Conference of 1970. It admonished the membership not to spread rumors, not to make false accusations, adding, quote, "For those who are under church appointment, to spend church time discussing, promoting, or encouraging dissension is to destroy the institution from which they derive their livelihood, as well as to destroy their own effectiveness as members in good standing." The upheaval and bitterness that arise from dissent must not be minimized, but the Stone Church congregation came under the spell of Carl Mesle, their new rock of stability. For those of you unfamiliar with the Stone Church in Independence, Missouri, I love this picture. The cornerstone was laid in 1888. Although the Independence RLDS congregation was established in 1873, the first brick church built by the RLDS in Independence was already too small for the membership by the time it was finished in 1884. The Stone Church, boasting a seating capacity of 1,500, held its first worship service in 1892. The church was located directly across the street from the temple lot, which church members coveted, probably the reorganization's original sin. Because the Hedrickites built only a modest church on the temple lot site, the Stone Church looked directly south, its view unimpeded, to the future site of the RLDS auditorium, eventually built in 1928. In his later years, Dad referred to the Stone Church as our cathedral. When church headquarters were moved to Independence from Lamoni, Iowa in 1911, and before the auditorium was built, the stone church was home to the RLDS General Conference and was considered the official pulpit from which the First Presidency delivered information they wanted to share with the entire church membership. The stone church of my childhood was a congregation of about 2,000 members. The sanctuary hosted 2 Sunday morning services, Sunday school for every age group, and a Sunday evening service. For boys, the congregation sponsored Boy Scout Troop 223, which included a Cub Pack, and for girls, it sponsored Skylarks and Orioles. A junior church at the 11 o'clock hour was held across the street in the Love House when I was in junior high. We also had an active science league for teenagers. When I graduated from high school in 1961, these programs were all strong. However, the neighborhood changed during the 60s, becoming a too typical inner city environment with drugs and crime moving in. In 1992, Dad reflected that when he became pastor, the church leadership had pretty much given up on the stone church and were extending their focus and financial support to other more suburban congregations. A letter expressing this sentiment dated August 27, 1969, from the Center Stake leadership and the then Stone Church pastor, addressed to the First Presidency, the presiding bishopric, and the apostle in charge, spoke to the deterioration of the surrounding area. Quote, "Some of the major problems we face are apparent. Others might not be so readily seen. First is the difficulty shared by all of Independence, the ever-increasing decline of the immediate area surrounding Stone Church, the auditorium, Center Stake offices, and the area known as Jackson Square. As you are aware, this decline is caused by a complex maze of reasons, not the least of which are economic and social. We share with knowledgeable men of Independence the feeling that the trend is yet to run its course and will not be halted until large sums of money are invested by the right people for the right reasons." The letter goes on to describe the declining attendance and income of the congregation, as well as the aging of its members. Fewer members with less income were left to address the needs of an also aging building, the old stone church. Why the First Presidency chose to assign Carl Mesle as pastor in 1970 is still buried in their inner office communications. But let me share with you one more key experience in Dad's background that prepared him for this ministry. As I mentioned, Dad was born in Oneida, New York, and grew up next door in Sherrill, New York, home of Oneida Silver Limited, which was owned by the Oneida community. This is important for 2 reasons. First, the Oneida community was founded on John Humphrey Noy's theology of perfectionism, a form of Christianity with 2 basic values: self-perfection and communalism. These ideals were translated into everyday life through shared property and work and abiding concern for the welfare of others. Noy's vision was a society where the interest of one member became the interest of all, the enlargement of the family. They called themselves perfectionists, that is, to be free of sin and to be perfect in this world, not just in heaven. The Oneida community practiced communalism in the sense of communal property and possessions, in essence, socialism. Second, Dad's father, Frank C. Mesle Jr., worked for Oneida Silver from the time he was 14 years old to his retirement in 1950. The business practices of Oneida Silver were the practices of the original Oneida community. The basic belief that all were deemed equal and all should be treated the same found the ultimate expression during the financial downtimes the company experienced, including the Great Depression. The president cut his own salary by half. Management salaries were cut by 33%. Worker salaries were cut proportionally. They shared in the bad times as well as the good. Dad carried this sense of community and practiced it throughout his life. It defined his sense of Zion. It was not just his professional Boy Scout experience in New Jersey and then in Kansas City after World War II that prepared him for a congregation with a robust youth program, which he initially developed in his role as Center Stake Youth Director, a deteriorating neighborhood, and a shrinking budget. He was also a community organizer and a professional volunteer trainer. Most of his years under appointment were spent developing, implementing, and leading the youth work of the World Church, and then training volunteer leaders in these programs. It was what he did best, and as pastor, he continued training volunteer leaders. There is one more presence in his life who contributed to Carl Mesle's success in the service of the church. His wife, Kay Sprague Mesle, not incidentally, a lifelong member of the Stone Church. These developmental experiences resulted in a gentleman who was comfortable with children, young people, and adults from all walks of life. In other words, the ideal minister to be pastor of the Stone Church in the troubled times of 1970. When Dad assumed his responsibilities on April 1, 1970, the general church membership was in pain due to the dissension brought about by the change in direction of the general church leadership. The Stone Church, a conservative, aging, inner-city congregation, was at the heart of the internal conflict between the fundamental believers and the progressives. I heard Dad say frequently, "I am not a theologian, I'm a minister of people." Keep in mind that the church leadership received bitter pushback from disheartened members who wanted to remain the one true church. Howard Sheehy Jr., Bud to most of us, of the first presidency at the time, remembers Carl Mesle as the quintessential staff person. He carried out the programs assigned to him by the first presidency with professionalism, never undermining the church leadership. Given the admonition from W. Wallace to the conference delegates in his Ethics of Dissent message in 1970, a perceived loyalist was, no doubt, the leader they wanted at the Stone Church. It was Carl Mesle's responsibility to minister to every member of the congregation, not just those on one side of the conflict or the other. According to Don Landon, who encouraged me to focus on this time and place in the life of the church, your father was forever the reconciler, not the ideologue. His inclusive ministry kept the Stone Church from becoming deeply involved in the fray. Pat Spillman shared his opinion. I knew your dad mostly by his reputation, with which I totally agree. He was a man of talent, eloquence, diplomacy, integrity, courage, and skill. I can easily understand why he appealed to both traditionalists and progressives. I believe he was in his heart one of the former, but was open enough to recognize the value of new ideas and the necessity of change. He was a person who could choose words that would inform and inspire without offense to either end of the continuum. A tightrope walker could not do as well. But inevitably, housekeeping chores must come first. During the first 4 years as pastor, Dad was met with 3 major facilities challenges. The congregation had voted in 1968 to address all 3 and had raised money toward those needs. However, it was left to the new pastor to complete the financing and implement these commitments. The first order of business was to replace all the stained glass windows. The sanctuary was so drafty due to its leaky 86-year-old windows that the church furnace couldn't keep it warm enough in winter for services. They had to meet downstairs. The story of the stained glass windows is a good example of Dad's loyalty to the fundamental story of the church. Jerry Winship, who served on the window design committee, reports that when the Stone Church needed to replace its stained glass windows, they hired Ron Dixon, an Irish Catholic designer who worked with the Stone Church committee to come up with a design acceptable to all. One challenge was a set of 3 windows about which there was much back and forth as to what to depict. Moses, Jesus, you get the idea. Mesle remarked, well, we have the 3 books, so why don't we take something from each one? The designer wanted to know what 3 books. So Dad proceeded to give him the Cliff Notes version of church history and the 3 books. Thus, it was decided. And you can look at the windows while I take a drink. The next project was to replace the pipe organ, making it the 3rd organ to grace the sanctuary. This was a project dear to Dad's heart, as he loved good music. The third was to replace and or repair some of the large stones in the stone church foundation. Not nearly so exciting, but their deterioration was hazardous, and so it was done. Added to these projects was the celebration of the congregation's centennial in 1973. This was not the church building centennial, but rather the establishment of the RLDS presence in Jackson County. On this occasion, Pastor Mesle invited all the living Stone Church pastors to participate in the anniversary service. 1970 was not the best of times for the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Several things were going on during the 1960s that facilitated discord in the membership. First, the church was developing several worldwide missions. The one that proved especially troubling to some true believers was the Sayora ethnic group in eastern India. This tribal community practiced polygamy, an abhorrent practice for RLDS members. The first presidency compromised with the Sayora's customs and allowed polygamists to be baptized with the understanding they would take no additional wives. Some church members could not tolerate that any church member would be a polygamist. Being RLDS was antithetical to practicing polygamy, the major factor that meant they were not Mormon. Another thorn in the side of some members was the development of the Sunday school curriculum by the young appointees in the Department of Religious Education. They were following in the footsteps of Roy Cheville by taking graduate work in theology, scripture, and Christian history, and it showed in their curriculum changes. Several of them were attending St. Paul School of Theology, a Methodist seminary in Kansas City, just 15 minutes away. Education, broadening one's horizons, is seen as a dangerous thing to many faithful, and the following development proved them right in their minds. It was these young appointees who persuaded the first presidency to invite 3 St. Paul professors to the auditorium in 1967 to conduct what came to be called the Joint Council Seminars. These seminars were the centerpiece of the fury that changed the life of the church. As described in the same Ethics of Dissent report in 1970 by the first presidency, quote, efforts on the part of the leadership of the church to produce a better educated ministerial corps and to develop a comprehensive contemporary restoration theology have created some tensions and unease, unquote. At issue for so many members was that leadership drew on some non-RLDS resources to examine and come to a restatement of fundamental doctrine. Following the Joint Council seminars, when some members felt threatened by the possibility of belonging to a church that no longer viewed itself as the one true church, Carl would ask someone, "What's happened to you in light of this? Let's think this through." Dad did not care so much about being the one true church. He cared more about how that affected people. But he described Dad as not the sage on the stage, but the guide by your side. The comments about Dad's ministry that echoed over and over was that he listened. He listened first before sharing his own ideas, whether it was one-on-one or in groups. A comment shared in the condolences section of the Speaks Funeral Home after Dad's death in 2014 was typical. He was like the calming grandfather who quietly counseled, shared stories, offered prayer, and a huge pair of shoulders upon which to lay your hurts, pain, sorrows, or joys as he patiently listened. When I asked Jerry Winship for stories about individuals and how Dad ministered to them regarding their experience of the dissension in the church, he said, "Sherry, you will not get those stories. Those were always private, and your dad would never betray a confidence." I had to agree. We children never heard Mom and Dad gossip. Richard Lancaster reported, Carl was a pastor at heart. So to some sense, that touches upon both his strength and weakness. It is hard to be everything. Nobody is. But I suspect Carl was not interested in theology, or he knew quite a bit about himself and stuck to what he did best, maybe better than anyone in the church. He goes on to say he had an unusual constellation of warm and dedicated personal qualities suited to his assignment and somewhat distinguished him from many of his peers under church appointment. It's no surprise that Richard reports he too was one of those who, when he was feeling overwhelmed, sought out Dad's counsel. You know, this made me wonder whom Dad sought out when he needed counsel. In his November 22, 1970 sermon, Dad says, "Given the willingness of my grandfather to listen to both sides, can I do any less?" One way in which Dad addressed the theological rift was by inviting speakers with both perspectives, or perhaps with multiple perspectives. A review of speakers in the Stone Church pulpit in the couple of years prior to his becoming pastor shows the names of those in church leadership positions: first presidency, apostles, bishopric, the pastor and assistant pastor, and other faithful Stone Church members, with a mere sprinkling of the young progressives. Carl Mesle's tenure showed a greater variety of speakers, some obviously traditionalists and others obviously progressives. Two of note who were well known outside the usual invitees were Atro Bartle, former mayor of Kansas City and former scout executive of the Kansas City Boy Scout Council, under whom Dad had served as field executive. The other was William T. Blue, the African-American pastor from Florida, who, along with his family, had suffered humiliating prejudice from many church members 20 years earlier, even as the church officially integrated its membership in 1956. We will hear about him at a later spring lecture shared by his daughter, Gwendolyn Hawksblue, and by Bill Russell. Dad's purpose in inviting liberals to speak was so people could say, "I disagree with what he is saying, but he is a good man," rather than saying, "I've heard horrible things about him." He required people to consider the ideas rather than the person. That didn't always work. Eventually, he invited Richard P. Howard, one of the particularly effective RLDS historians, to preach. He made a comment about how the King James Version could be found. Oh, I left a line out. Oh no, between services, Dick attended Thelona Stevens' class on the inspired version of the Bible. He made a comment about how the King James Version could be found in the Book of Mormon, after which Smith gave the church the inspired version. She immediately changed the subject. After Dick's sermon, she went through the receiving line and gave him the standard "how much I enjoyed your sermon" comment. However, the next day she went to the Stone Church office to see Dad and said, "If you ever again invite that man to speak, I will not set foot again in the Stone Church." We don't know Dad's response, but Dick reports that he indeed never preached there again. Dad and Richard Lancaster worked very closely together in World Church youth programs, so much so that Lancaster took over that responsibility when Dad's assignment was changed in the late 1950s. Dick was one of the young Turks who eventually left the professional ministry and found a distinguished role in higher education. Richard recalled that when he was president of Simpson College, Dad invited him to preach at the Stone Church. He was quite surprised, had not preached in several years, but still held his priesthood. So he preached what he felt was a decent sermon of hope and understanding. Richard felt that Dad wanted the older folks in the congregation to see that the younger people were still offering this kind of ministry, rather than pushing their new suspect ideas. And Richard was one of those who had held suspect ideas. Dad reported he preached only every 6 or 7 Sundays because so many qualified and eager men, including members of the church leadership, were awaiting their turn to occupy our pulpit. As described earlier, Stone Church attendance was dwindling in the late 60s, and the hair on the faithful grew whiter all the time. Official records suggest that membership itself was not falling, but attendance was. Dad always believed that good communications improve motivation, so he immediately established a monthly newsletter embodying the highlights of our planned ministry and reflecting as many of the good things happening in the congregation as we could reasonably carry. "I have no question," he said, "but that our friendly newsletter helped bring people to church." My first assignment proved to be, Dad speaking again, my first assistant proved to be so fundamental that I was hesitant to have him occupy the pulpit. He ended up as the presiding evangelist of the Restoration movement. Nonetheless, we stopped the downward movement of our membership and attendance, but could not get it back up. So I battled for an associate and finally was rewarded with David Kaleakau, whose fine ministry helped us fill the Stone Church again and gave me a little time off. With 2,000 members and an average attendance of 800 plus, I had to be in the church office by 7 a.m. in order to get any work and planning done before members came to consult me. An important piece of Dad's leadership style was to bring together a group of concerned and invested people to discuss problems, share experiences and observations, and explore solutions and general programming. It didn't matter to him whether they were loyalists or progressives. In fact, he preferred a mix. At Mom and Dad's house on the first Sunday of the month following the evening service, Dad met, quote, with my counselors, all departmental leaders, office personnel, and at varied times with everyone from the head deacon to our bus drivers. Some 20 to 30 would share in light refreshments and good fellowship before settling down to reports from each department, which would include ideas for improvement of programs to ways of better coordinating efforts for better ministry. This was extended annually to the entire congregation, giving all the opportunity for fellowship and a sense of ownership of the programs. And keep in mind that these were volunteers. Dad was blessed with an extraordinarily good woman in his wife, Kay. He described her unique contributions in serving the congregation. She initiated a Sunday noon lunch for all visitors from out of town who did not have local attachments. Visitors from all over the world and of all faiths came to those luncheons, where they usually had the opportunity to engage the day's preacher in conversation. It was a winner, and I am sure helped send up our attendance. This is a variation of Dad's theme of bringing people together so they could talk and share ideas. The temptation to vilify strangers was averted by making them friends or at least acquaintances. When the stained glass windows had to be replaced, Kay led the work of converting the beautiful colored pieces into angels, stars, and other attractive window show pieces. For this project, she learned how to make leaded stained glass work. When she and Dad traveled, she was always on the lookout for pieces she liked, purchasing them to take home and copy as best she could. Dad adds, on Thanksgiving and Christmas, she also postponed our family get-together by serving lunch for all who would otherwise be eating their holiday meals alone. Dad knew that in order to maintain and even increase attendance, he needed to provide programming for all ages. He believed strongly and had shared as much with church leadership that youth programs needed to be present and supported. Without ministry to the church's children and young people, there would be no further future members. Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts had always been strong at the Stone Church, and that continued. Skylarks for young girls, Orioles for older girls continued, as did Science League for teenagers. Pastor Carl Mesle knew every child by name. There were 200 kids in all these programs. He not only knew their names, but he knew what badge they were working on, what problems they were having at home or school. And he always offered help without imposing himself on them. He knew what they were capable of and helped them achieve it. When Julie Meisinger was an Oriole at the Stone Church, she observed an interesting exchange among her own good friend, Verta Bryant, and Carl Mesle. Verta Bryant was the author of Between the Covers of the Book of Mormon for children. She was a great storyteller, but a formidable woman, and the grandmother of some stalwart JWHA members, perhaps even some attending this lecture. She asked Julie's good friend, who happened to be the great-granddaughter of Israel A. Smith, a question about the Book of Mormon. The girl was from a Smith family line that had not continued active membership in the church. When Miss Smith confessed she didn't know anything about the Book of Mormon, Verta, exasperated, said, "You're a Smith. How can you not know about the Book of Mormon?" Carl Mesle, who happened on the scene, said, "How can you know what you are not taught?" He saved them both from themselves and from each other gently. Margie Siegfried Stuber was just a girl when Dad was her pastor at the Stone Church, but she reports she was always aware that he was her pastor, saying, "I knew that he knew my name and who I was. He wasn't loud or powerful. He didn't command with a loud voice. He commanded with kindness." He was simultaneously joyful with the children and dignified with church ritual. My cousin Ginger shared with me that when her husband was being trained in the rituals surrounding passing the offering basket, he complained to Carl about how stiff and formal everything was. Carl then very kindly explained that casual attire was all right for the suburban congregations, But the Stone Church was the oldest and most respected congregation of the RLDS community, and so it was important that it remain a dignified atmosphere. The church and its rituals, I have to tell you that Dad would change out of his coveralls and put on a shirt and tie to go to the cleaners to pick up the cleaners. The church and its rituals were dignified, but this pastor reached out to all his parishioners, even the not so dignified. Ms. Meisinger tells another story to illustrate her point that Dad was always looking for the good in people. Her nanny was a regular churchgoer, but her dad lived a rough life. One evening, Pastor Carl Mesle came to the house for a visit. In the course of the conversation, he advised her father that he had a call to the priesthood. Julie's nanny was aghast. How can that be? He isn't like the priesthood members. He drinks like a fish and smokes like a stove. Mesle reached over and put his hand on her husband's and said, Jesus didn't call perfect people to help him spread the gospel. He called those willing to strive to be better. But I don't know how to do that, her father replied. But his pastor reassured him, saying, we'll walk this together. This is another example of Carl Mesle, the guide by your side. Julie's father was ordained to the priesthood. He did give up smoking and drinking, and he became active with the Boy Scouts, helping them achieve their Eagle Scout awards. Needless to say, his entire family was affected by his change. Again, my cousin Ginger observed, from my perspective, Carl was one of the more progressive church leaders of his time. I had observed him speaking for those members who were on the fringes of church life, hoping to meet their needs, while others were more concerned with keeping up appearances. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. They drew a circle that shut him out. But Love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and took him in. Another example is shared by Bill Russell in his 2002 JWHA article on the creation of the Restoration Church, in which he describes the splitting of one of the splinters from the RLDS. The Saturday night class, which began in Independence in 1981, was led by good friends of Dad's in the church, including a man named Bill Wenham. Wenham, although the first to baptize members in Korea, became one of the first apostles in the Restoration Church. He was also everyone's favorite barber. Among his long-term clients were Bill Russell and Carl Mesle. Bill shared this story with me. One day I asked him if any of the men who were his customers before 1984 remained as customers. He said Carl Mesle was the only one. I thought that spoke very well for Carl as the Christian gentleman we always knew about him, said Bill Russell. The Cultural Crisis Commission, a child of the Joint Council seminars, has a section on relationship of the culture and church. Relationship of the church and culture, which includes the statement, some would like to be separate from the world, but it is impossible because our cultural influences the church and the church has an impact on the culture. Among Dad's qualities as a minister and pastor was his commitment to meeting the needs of people, whether they were his parishioners or his neighbors. There were lots of needs in the neighborhood at that time, as described above. In his efforts to define the needs and figure out ways to meet them, he utilized all his experiences from his official Boy Scout training and experience as a field executive to all his assignments while working for the church. Carl Mesle was particularly good at bringing together experts in their fields to work together for a common purpose, observed Bud Sheehy. This longtime practice aided Dad in meeting the needs of the Stone Church neighborhood, which were overwhelming for most, including apparently for the general church leadership. When they appointed Dad as the pastor, they probably did not know they were also getting a community organizer. Jerry Winship, for years the Stone Church bishop's agent and Dad's community development buddy, described Dad as an octopus with tentacles everywhere. The community had needs and the pastor had solutions. For example, the Stone Church established a preschool for the children of neighborhood parents, church or not, who needed childcare while they worked. That preschool continues today and is a well-respected, successful model program. Dad's work included initiating the Independence Plan for neighborhood councils, of which there were 42, a neighborhood council for each identified neighborhood. Formed in 1971, its mission today continues to provide all residents of the defined neighborhoods, whether homeowners or renters, a voice in activities, development, neighborhood maintenance, and the Neighborhood Watch program. His work with the neighborhood councils amplified his role as pastor, essentially another model for providing what the people needed. In 1970, he and Mom instituted weekly Wednesday luncheons for people who were lonely, elderly, and in need of fellowship and balanced diets, including the aforementioned kick dancer at the auditorium. Volunteers took meals to some who lived alone and were unable to come to the church. This program eventually merged with other churches into the Meals on Wheels program. The World Church, through its Central Development Association, owned all churches' properties. Central Professional Improvement was an affiliate, but there was a third organization which called itself Central Development Improvement. CDI was a not-for-profit group made up of 20 members, including Carl Mesle, each of whom contributed $25 a month to the finances over 3 or 4 years. This Stone Church coalition, chaired by Bishop O.C. Henson, was concerned about the need for affordable housing in the Stone Church neighborhood. Paul Roberts of Andes and Roberts Builders, a successful development company in Independence, presented CDI with his vision of a sizable apartment building that would help meet this need. With a push from Mesle and a nod of approval from Bishop Winship, this group of Stone Church members committed to a 40-year mortgage to build Heritage House, situated prominently in the McCoy neighborhood, which was Stone Church's neighborhood. According to Jerry Winship, it was Dad, as pastor of the Stone Church, who was instrumental in making this happen. As a side note, when the mortgage on Heritage House was retired recently, a private company purchased it for $4.4 million. An unfortunate event gave the pastor yet another opportunity to reach out to share resources, this time with a different faith group in the neighborhood. One reporter in the Examiner wrote, quote, "Stone Church is presently sharing Partridge Hall with its Independence Christian School, sponsored by the Waldo Avenue Baptist Church. The church building was destroyed by fire on September 1, 1978, and the Stone Church, along with other organizations of the community, extended immediate help. 250 students in grades 1 through 10 were going to school 5 days a week on floors A and C. The Stone Church preschool occupies floor B. Congregation members are most happy to share their building with their Baptist neighbors." Ever the octopus, Carl Mesle was at the hospital regularly visiting the sick and afflicted, and I bet you chocolate he performed more funerals than any other church official. He was instrumental in starting an outreach ministry to church members in prison, serving as parole officers on occasion for those who were released. And he was an active member of the Independence Ministerial Alliance, which made him part of the greater Christian community, anathema to RLDS traditionalists. Excuse me. This outreach on the part of the pastor and the congregation came from the heart of Carl Mesle, who said repeatedly, "I am not a theologian, I am a minister of people." In essence, he was mirroring the new direction being taken by church leadership to become a church of mission. This direction may seem obviously the right thing to us today, but it was not obvious to those who were raised with the admonition to be in the world, but not of it. And I'm going to let you look at these 3 pictures again while I take a drink. As Dad recalled, we were doing well financially, even though for every $8 that came in from the members, 5 went to support the World Church. And we had built a happy, cooperative team. Then the apostle shook us up by announcing my retirement on my 65th birthday, October 14, 1979. I left reluctantly. The congregation arranged a lovely retirement service attended by his children and grandchildren, at which he was ordained to the office of Patriarch Evangelist. However, he had also received a letter from W. Wallace Smith on behalf of the Joint Council, advising him that retirement from his full-time church service would be effective December 31, 1979, that year, and he would be recognized for his years of ministry by the honor of superannuation at the 1980 World Conference. In other words, he would not be given another assignment. Superannuation is intended, according to the 2004 Priesthood Manual, to be an honor. Not all appointees experienced it that way, including Dad. He was crushed. He was so hurt he did not even share the contents of this letter with Mom. I would submit, however, that he went on in retirement to serve with the same pastoral ministry for the City of Independence as he had for the Stone Church. He remained fully engaged until 6 months before he died on July 23, 1914, at the age of 99 years, 9 months, and 9 days. Thank you.
I regret that now is the time to bring our evening to a close. Thank you so much, Sherry, for sharing your knowledge of Carl Mesle with us tonight. This was a real treat, and I especially loved the photographs that you shared tonight.
Thank you.
Also want to thank Megan and Peter for helping co-host this evening and for managing everything from behind the scenes. You two are the best. And lastly, we share our thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites with your generous donations. Thank you so much for your support. And I encourage you to tune in next week as we hear from our friend Matthew Bolton about Apostle Charles Neff, another significant mover and shaker in Community of Christ history. Matthew's lecture is going to be called From Militarized Mission to Radical Resistance, Post-Colonial Reflections on Charles D. Neff's Legacy. It may be a long title, but it's sure to be a good lecture. Megan has already dropped a link to the spring lecture series in the chat box, so be sure to follow that link to register for next week's program with Matthew Bolton. So until next Thursday, friends, take care, keep reading your church history, and have a blessed night.